Hi, I'm Ben with Filthy Motorsports, and in this video we're going to be talking about the rear shocks on a 4Runner GX and FJ platform. Now I know this sounds like a very specific video, but it does apply to other applications as well, so it's worth watching. But specifically on the 4Runner platform, this is what most people do wrong, and still a lot of reputable shops are really surprised to hear when we explain this to them. And that they've been selling the wrong rear shocks for the 4Runner for a long time. So here's our 4Runner. For some reason, you can't get a 4Runner model. I don't know if it's a trademark or a copyright thing, but here's our 4Runner. Up front, we've got an independent front suspension system. So like a lot of modern trucks and SUVs, the IFS system can get repositioned, usually between 1.5 to 2.5 inches of lift. And the front end, that's the easy part. Once you get to the rear end, it's easy on most vehicles. But on the 4Runner, there's a really important thing you need to know. So from the factory, the back end of a 4Runner has 8.5 inches of travel, which is plenty. It's actually fantastic. Here is a shock shaft from the back end of a stock length 4Runner. Looks like more than 8.5 inches, but it actually is right on 8.5. Now this is a great amount of travel for a stock SUV. From the factory, it's set at about 5 to 5.5 inches of up travel. And that's great because if you add some weight to the back end of the vehicle, it sags down. You still have 4 and 4. And so, as you've seen in other videos of mine, 4 inches is kind of the magic number. We want to have 4 inches of movement in either direction. And then the ride height needs to be somewhere in the middle. As long as we've got 4 inches of movement in either direction, the valving, the tuning, the setup's gonna work well. We can get more specific on that, but that's the general rule of thumb that we use. So a 5-inch ride height from the factory settles down to 4 inches under load. Fantastic. Now, here's where people go wrong. So you bring the front end up 1.5 inches, and that levels out a typical 4Runner. Simple setup. Not very common. Most of our clients, and I'm not saying one is right or wrong, they both work well, but most of our clients are going to 33-inch tires, and they want the 2 to 2.5 inches of lift on the front end. Once the front end is lifted 2.5 inches, the rear end really wants to come up about 1.75 inches to 2 and 2.25. Why those numbers? Well, there's really nothing scientific about it other than that is what a vast majority of our clients say looks the best. Of course, ride height is pretty subjective and it's pretty personal. It's the stance that you're looking for and the rate that you're looking for. If you do a lot of hauling and towing, you might want the rear end higher unloaded so that it's got more room to sag. That's not the point. The thing is, once the front end gets lifted more than 1.5 inches over stock average off the lot height, the rear end needs to come up at least 1.75 inches to 2 inches. So you go from a ride height where the seals, and so this is the seal head and the wiper seal, you go from it riding at about 5 inches all the way up to it riding at around 7 inches. And most of you should already be catching on as to why that's a problem. So now we've got 7 inches of compression, but we've only got 1 inch, 1.5 inches, maybe 2 of extension. And so what happens is if you keep the same stock length rear shock and just throw it on the vehicle and raise it 2 inches, you start getting the topping out. And we see this across a lot of brands, and most of the time when you hear someone complaining about any brand of high-end shock not riding well and they spent all this money and it rides terribly, that's why. It's a great shock, it's just it's the wrong size or it's wrong for the application. So there's something even worse than that, and that is that when you go to a 33-inch tire, the tire ends up hitting the fender at full compression. So once you've gone to a 33 to 85, somewhere in that range, you can't actually use all of your compression because the tire will end up contacting the fenders. So what you do is you install a 2-inch bump stop spacer. Well, once you install a 2-inch bump stop spacer, you're actually giving up about 2 inches of up travel on the shaft. They don't really fit up like this, but if you think about it, if you're stopping the up travel, you're giving up That much travel on your shock. Now remember, we only had 8.5 inches to begin with. Once you cut out 2 inches of compression, you've gone from an 8.5 inch travel shock to a 6.5 inch travel shock. And that is a lot of money to spend to cut out 25% of your suspension travel. So that's what we see we see this all the time. And in fact, we had a set of shocks, what kind of spurred this video is we had a set of shocks come in for service. They've had a rough life, as you can probably tell, even though there's surface rust on it. I was told that this vehicle sat out in the rain for like 5 years, unused. So after being driven down dirt roads every day of its life up until that point, customer decided not to have us paint these. This could easily have been sanded and painted, but that's a different story. We got these shocks, and one of them came apart fine, but the other one had topped out so many times that the seal head inside here was trying to override the retaining ring, and it was jammed. It was actually the worst top out jam we've ever had to deal with. We even had to cut the shaft to shove the inside part in and get the rod end out so we can work on it. We managed to save them, but that's what happens when you buy a shock that's the wrong length. When you're buying shocks, regardless of the application, whether it's an Ultra 4 car or a rock crawler or a mud truck, it is so important that you match full compression to full compression. And then of course you get all of the available extension out of that shock, but you got to make sure that the shock is matched up at full compression. So what we do is whenever we know the vehicle is going to have a 2-inch bump stop spacer and or a 2-inch rear lift, and we know that there's going to be a 2-inch bump stop spacer between the frame and the bump stop, we build a shock that's roughly 2 inches longer. Now there's a very specific measurement that we use. It's not just shock plus 2 inches, but we add that to the cylinder length. What's really nice about that is that also allows us to get a longer shaft in there. Now we don't quite gain 2 inches in extra shaft length. We could, but there is a limit where we can't let the suspension droop out too far due to drive shaft linkage, brake line, and other issues. So we end up cutting it back, but we go from 8.5 inches of travel to 9.5 inches of travel when we do that. Better yet, we're trading that 2 inches of up travel for extra down travel. So you're technically keeping the same amount of up travel because you've lifted the vehicle 2 to 2.5 inches, you've cut out 2 inches of up travel, and we're gaining 3 inches of down travel. So really you're going from 6.5 inches of travel to 9.5 inches of travel. And that is why you absolutely must have a custom length rear shock for the back of a 4Runner. Some shops are claiming that they're selling a extended travel rear shock. The problem with that is, I don't know if I've got a sample of it, it's not exactly, we see this on a lot of applications. They're just removing the internal shaft spacer that's a 1/4 inch. So be very careful with marketing terms. Extended travel, yes, it has an application on the front coilovers, but when it comes to rear shocks and others, extended travel can mean you get an extra 1/4 inch of travel. That's not going to make a difference, and in some cases that can actually make the shock a little bit weaker on the topping out. Some applications, not quite the 4Runner. So it has to be a very specific length. To make things even trickier than that, for the back end of a 4Runner, I think we offer 10 or 12 rear springs. So part of the reason that the 4Runner platform rides so well is that it's very particular. It's very sensitive. It's sensitive to variations in weight. And when you're running a quality rear spring, every spring on the market that we recommend has about a 200 to maybe 300 pound variable range, meaning that it'll sit high. It'll sit at its high point unloaded, and then with 200 to 300 pounds in the cargo area, it'll sit level or maybe a little bit below level. So 200 to 300 pounds is not a lot of weight, but that is the range of most springs. So sometimes it gets tricky. If you've got a customer, if we've got a client that has an overlanding setup or 4 mountain bikes on a bike rack and they want to tow and haul, you have to set things up in very specific ways because the springs are really sensitive. Now, the benefit to having sensitive springs is that you always get really good ride quality when they're matched up correctly. And so I've told every single one of our 4Runner GX customers that expect to own multiple sets of rear springs. If you own the vehicle long enough, expect to own them. And they're $200, $250, $300 for the pair. They're easy to swap out, and it's something that should be done every time that the vehicle's not quite at the stance that you want it to be. You swap out the rear coil springs. Now, here's the catch. While we work with major brands of springs, and we're picky about which ones we work with, in that, with 200 to 400 pounds added to the back end of the vehicle, you get springs that allow all available suspension travel. Once you get into the heavier spring rate, so that would be 400, 600, 800 pounds of permanent weight added to the back of the vehicle, the springs start to get shorter at their free length. So if you keep this shock, the full length rear shock, and you go from a 200 pound spring to a 300 pound spring to a 400 pound spring, and the springs are working well, that's great. But in the 4Runner application, the shock is also the limiting strap. It catches the axle to prevent it from unseating the springs and causing issues with the drive shaft and the linkage system. So the shocks themselves are the limiting straps, and that's partly why we can't get the extra 2 inches of travel out of them. We technically could, but we have to limit them to where we know the suspension system has to be caught. Also with KDSS systems, that's another story, but everything applies. Once you go to a 500, 600, 700, 800, 1,000 pound rear spring, those springs are shorter. And so inside of the shock, we have to put a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch limiting spacer so that the shock doesn't extend out all the way and prevents the springs from unseating. Again, that's the same spacer that I was showing you before. We just stack them up in there and it prevents the shock from dripping out. The good news is that spacer can be added after the fact, or if you come back down, you can remove that spacer. So we always build the shocks to maximum length, and then we use the internal spacers to limit them up so that you've got the safest and best setup. Finally, while the added travel is great and the proper matched up shock is great, the most important thing is that now with the proper length rear shock, with the lift on the vehicle, you're still, depending on what stance you want, your ride height is right in the sweet spot where you have 4 to 5 inches of up travel, 4 to 5 inches of down travel, both loaded and unloaded. And that is how we get the absolute best performance out of the back end of a 4Runner FJ, some series of Land Cruisers and the GXs. So that's what you need to know, and that is why we use custom length rear shocks on the back end of these platforms.